Last week, I introduced a series of messages on entitled Advice from a Friend, Lessons of the Proverbs. Roger, I think I'm getting a little feedback here. Thanks. The book of Proverbs, I think a lot of times people get a sense that the Bible really only deals with things like heaven and angels and the unseen spiritual world. But the primary emphasis of the Bible is in the here and in the now, something extraordinarily relevant, designed by God to help our lives, to bless our lives, to help prosper our existence. That's really, I think, what God's great wisdom is to provide for us. And it's kind of coalesced in this book of Proverbs, very relevant to our lives, things about how we deal with our neighbors, about anger, about sexual temptation. And today, I want to look at this theme of our resources, our finances, our money. There's nothing that is probably more pertinent in our journey than how it's lived out in regards to our money, where the rubber hits the road, and how we feel about our pocketbooks and our checkbooks. Finances, of course, are often a cause of great conflict. As a pastor, I see many times couples really bickering and fighting foundationally about money and finances. And I think the Bible has, some extraordinary wisdom to impart guidelines, principles, kind of set up on this series of aphorisms, these different proverbs, little catchy phrases that are meant to kind of weave into our minds and begin to kind of work their way into our souls as we're expressing our lives. And so in your outline, in your bulletin, I've placed a whole list of these little short sayings that are going to kind of try to tie together today. But I'd like to start with a word of prayer. Lord, may the words of my mouth and meditations of all of our hearts, Lord, I pray that they'll be found loving and acceptable in your sight. Lord, you are our rock, and you are our Redeemer. Amen. I noticed with interest, a new movie has just been released, starring George Clooney and Julia Roberts. It has a catchy title that preachers always gravitate towards, and it's called The Money Monster. And George Clooney plays this kind of television cable guru, financial guru. And he often goes and he interviews folks about how to manage their finances and often gives wise investment advice. And as the movie trailer kind of indicates, that while he was filming one of his shows, a gunman came in with a bomb and a gun and took George Clooney hostage. He is wanting answers because there was an investment that George Clooney had kind of recommended, a hot stock, a no-fail kind of investment option, and that suddenly it vaporized. And that this particular individual lost his life savings. And as he's seen his world crumble, he wants answers. And so he straps a bomb on George Clooney. And that's kind of the premise of how the movie is to unfold. But as the trailer is kind of unwinding, the tagline for The Money Monster caught my attention. It said it's a story of greed, of fraud, of misuse of the public trust. Greed, fraud, misuse of the public trust. A brand new movie, an ancient dilemma. Because that's exactly what the Proverbs helps us address as far as how we handle our finances and how we kind of avoid those challenges of greed, of fraud, and misuse of the public trust. The Bible has, I think, a lot to say about how we deal with our money. And as you really kind of dig into the Proverbs, what you begin to discover is there's a theme that kind of emanates from it, is that there is a power to money, a deep power that you really can't always just kind of put a specific handle to, that it does have power, and that this power can be an opportunity of great blessing. Money has the power to do great things. In fact, in contrast to the other world religions of the time, which often saw the material world as evil and polluted, and the spiritual world as pure and good, or in the Eastern religions of the time, where the material world is just an illusion, the Hebrews, the people, the biblical faith, says that God created all of which we have, and it is intended to bless our lives. Remember Genesis 1? God created, and he said it was good. That's a foundational understanding of our faith, that the material world is to bless us, and that we have been created with a sense of creativity. We are made in the image of God to use our ingenuity, to use our resourcefulness, to use our hands to be a blessing. And that's good. Prosperity in the Proverbs is really a sense of really utilizing your creativity, your ingenuity. I mean, this verse in Proverbs chapter 10 just kind of indicates that. The blessing of the Lord makes rich and adds no sorrow with it. Please hear this. Many people mistakenly say money is the root of all evil. It is not. Money is not, it's not what the Bible says, actually. The Bible says it's the love of money that can be the root of all evil. It is the root of all evil. But money itself, it certainly can be opportunities to bless people's lives. There's no more greater evidence of that than when you leave this parking lot today. You're going to look over and you're going to be invited to sign some of the framing for Charlene's Habitat for Humanity house. Now, do you think Charlene's Habitat for Humanity house just kind of popped out of thin air? No. It took your faithfulness, it took your willingness to make your offerings to provide for the finances for that particular home. It takes your volunteer hours to contribute to making a dream become a possibility. Money really can be to bless people. The biblical Proverbs connects prosperity really with hard work, and we see that. Habitat House. You want other evidence of how money can be a blessing? Oh my goodness, we're right over in the other service over at the Activity Center. We're sending out, we're commissioning a team of 36 youth and adults going to the Columbus Colony of the Deaf. We've only are able to provide those kind of trips to help minister to the deaf community because of the resources provided by all of you to make those kind of trips possible. You want other evidence? If you would have been here this week, this place was humming. It started at about 8:30 every morning. It kind of wound down at around 9 o'clock at night. We had nearly 300 children from our community. They're coming here. They're learning the stories of our faith. They're interacting with other believers, other Christian adults. They're loving on these kids. And did that just happen? No. All of it was because of the gifts that makes ministries like Vacation Bible School possible. Money has a power to bless people's lives. That's a foundational thing of the biblical worldview. But here's the thing. In the Bible, there's also this deep sense that money has another power, and that can be a power to corrupt us. that it can entice us. It can become our God, almost another idol within our existence. For instance, if you turn to Proverbs 11, chapter 1, or verse 1, you'll see that it says, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord. What this is in reference to is unfair business practices. You know, nowadays we do insider trading, or we shave corners, or we we violate our integrity in a business deal. There's many ways by where we can have corrupt business practices. Back then it was scales. That was the management of their commerce. And then people would weigh their scales or have incorrect scales. Why? For their personal benefit. And what Proverbs says is that these false balances, these false scales, are an abomination. That is a strong Hebrew word. It's usually reserved for idolatry, that is considered an abomination. And what really the writer of Proverbs and what the biblical sense is, when we have unfair business practices, we violate the public good. That is a loss of righteousness. Righteousness is for the benefit of the public good. Unrighteousness is when you do it for your own personal benefit. It goes on in 11 verse 3. The crookedness of the treacherous destroys them. Do you hear that? Hear that hard word? If you are crooked, it destroys you. It begins to kind of suck your soul. And we know what the allure and the temptation of money can do to kind of pull people away from what they know is right and to live lives of integrity. In 11, chapter 4, or verse 4, it says, you know, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. Do you notice in this verse, there's a clear sense that there is a day of wrath. A day of accountability. We call it Judgment Day. At the end of our lives, we will be held accountable for what we have been given. And are we going to squander these gifts? Are we just going to lose sight of what we've been given and waste it? Or instead, are we going to use that which we've been provided, our gifts, our talents, our resources, to be a blessing, not just for us to consume, but to share for the greater public good? That's really what is brought out here. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath. Righteousness, the public good, is that which delivers from death. Okay, so we see here in this biblical worldview that money is a great thing. It can be a blessing. In fact, John Wesley, the founder of the people called Methodists, said the first rule in regards to our resources that we should make all that we can. Money is not filthy lucre, okay? It can be a great blessing. That's the first thing. Money, though, has a power, doesn't it? Has a power to kind of weave into our lives. And what we have here, I put out what I call 4 great principles of the Proverbs. That if you can memorize these 4 things, you're going to kind of get a sense of what is the financial advice of the Bible. First of all, we've got to be willing to find our priorities. For instance, in 23 verses 4 and 5, it says this: do not wear yourself out to get rich, but be wise enough to desist. When your eyes light upon it, it is gone, for suddenly it takes wings to itself, flying like an eagle towards heaven. The book of Job puts it a little bit different way. It says, naked you came, and naked you will return. You know, I mean, that's how it goes. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. That we all realize that we can't take away. I've done many a funeral service, friends, many a funeral service. I have been in many of a director's car heading out to the cemetery. And you know what? I've never seen a U-Haul follow behind that particular hearse. It doesn't happen. I tell people at every service that I officiate at that, at the end of our lives, when our own last chapter is written, our possessions nor our accomplishments ultimately don't matter much, do they? What is it that foundationally matters are our relationships. Our relationship to our Creator, our relationships with one another. That's what lasts. That's what carries on. And if you are investing yourself in something that is not going to last, it's really kind of a worthless investment, isn't it? We should invest our lives in that which is eternal. And that's a foundational principle. We got to find our priorities, invest in relationships. I want to say that again. Invest our time, our talents, our treasures in relationship, because that's what's going to carry on. Everything else is going to all just kind of wither away. Okay, the second piece of wisdom is that we got to avoid living beyond our means. Every day you go to the mail, you will find a credit card offer. They'll give you a big line of credit. You can scroll through your social media. You just push a button now, and almost like refinance. They even advertise. You can refinance your house with a push of the button. And it's like, wow. People are going deeper and deeper into debt, and they're digging themselves a bigger and bigger hole. And as Will Rogers famously said, if you find yourself digging a hole you want to get out of, you got to stop digging. And so, consequently, we really have to avoid living beyond our means. In Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7, it says this: "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is the slave to the lender." That's strong language. It's saying that when we go into debt, we are in slavery to that whom we are indebted to. And so, frankly, one of the best ways to help not live beyond our means is sometimes you got to cut up and do a little plastic surgery. I'm not talking a tummy tuck. I'm talking about cutting up credit cards. Doing some stunning statistics that in America today, the average household carries $5,700 of credit card debt. $5,700. That's not your mortgage. That's not your car payment. That is credit card debt, $5,700 that people are carrying over month after month. But what's even more stunning is that 60% of households in America have no credit card debt. In other words, that's what skews the number, that 40% of Americans are what's raising that number up to that $5,700 level. That while spending and indebtedness goes up, that savings continues to decrease. In the early 1990s, that Americans saved on average around 10 to 12% of their income, and now that hovers around the 5%. It's actually coming up a little bit from the last couple of years, and that's a good sign. Personal savings. Yeah, I mentioned that John Wesley, the founder of the people called Methodists, he said his first rule was to make all you can, but his second rule was then to save all you can, to prepare yourself for that inevitable rainy day that does come when expenses mount. I think the third piece of financial wisdom that we find in Proverbs is this: we got to be willing to practice generosity towards the poor. For instance, in 1917, it says this: "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full." In chapter 11, verse 25, it says, "A generous person will be enriched, and anyone who gives water will get water." Now, I think we've all been in that situation. We've been there. You're going to work. You're pulling off the side by coming down the overpass, and you invariably see the person with the sign, kind of asking for food. And then you're in this kind of quandary, what do? You have that little compulsion. Should you give the person a couple of bucks? And you're waiting for the light to turn. You kind of hope that you don't get stopped by the light. And you're in that situation. What do? How do you respond as followers? In practicing generosity to the poor. That's what it is by prudent financial management. But it's not an easy question, because in many cases, those who are on those particular paths, they are dealing with other issues of addiction. And if you give them cash, that's almost like giving fuel to an addict. Are you really blessing them? Are you helping them? Tough challenges. And I don't have a grand blanket statement. I do know this. Here at our church, we have a fish fund for emergency needs that come up with people, unexpected expenses. And what we've done is we never give people cash. We might provide housing assistance. We might do food. We provide for mortgage payments or rental payments. We do those kind of things. We provide to the providers. We don't give cash simply because we've seen that it's not always the prudent thing to do. But we can't make a blanket statement. Maybe you're going to feel a calling from God to give. I was just with my friend Tony Medaglia on Memorial Day. And Tony was talking about how she had been working late at night. She's a doctor over in Notre Dame. And Tony came out, and she was, her mind was on a lot of different things. And she comes out, and she sees this guy. It's late at night, and she's a little uncomfortable out in the parking deck. And she doesn't know what to do. And he's asking for a handout. Hey, can you spare some change? And Tony reached in, and all she had was a $50 bill. And she wasn't going to do anything. And she looked, and the guy had a Notre Dame shirt on. And her husband works at Notre Dame. And so she felt that as maybe a sign of God. So she reached in and gave him the 50. He hit the jackpot that night, may I add. And, she's thinking about it. And she wanted to go back and talk to him a little bit. And she turned around, and he was gone. She thought, well, maybe that was an angel. And that she was just to be an instrument of that. I can't say as a blanket statement about how we are to practice our generosity to the poor, but certainly that is a foundational life principle, not only, as I mentioned, to remember our priorities, not only to not live beyond our means, but to practice generosity to the poor. I think final thing that you see is this idea of giving not only to the poor, but giving to God. In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 to 10, it says this: honor the Lord with your substance, with the first fruits, circle that, first fruits of your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. This is really this understanding from the Bible of a tithe. A tithe is the very best that you have, not the leftovers. It's the best that you have that you set aside, and it says it belongs to God. Early on in our marriage, Amy and I made this commitment that no matter what our financial status was, we were always going to give the first 10% back to God, to God's ministry. And we've never regretted that. We've always said that we live better on 90% than we will ever live on 100%. I'm so thankful that with our church we have that electronic funds transfer, that it just kind of goes out. It's even before it hits us, it goes to God and to the work of his ministry. What a vital thing. It gives us the freedom then to go beyond our tithe, to do an offering for things that we feel passionate about, like Royal Family Kids Camp or Habitat for Humanity, things that kind of stir us into action to go above and beyond, to give not only a tithe, but to give an offering to God. Okay, there's your financial principles right there as far as finding our priorities, avoid living beyond our means, practicing generosity to the poor, and giving to God. But at the end of the day, is it wealthy or is it to be enriched? What kind of legacy do we want to leave? This afternoon, I'm heading out to Lakeside, Ohio, to our annual conference. We have this every year up at Lakeside. And this year is noteworthy because one of the parts of the celebration is that our resident bishop, John Hopkins, is going to be retiring. After 12 years of ministry within this area, we've been blessed by having him. And I'll never forget when he came 12 years ago, I said, John Hopkins, isn't that a university in Baltimore? Don't they have a really good lacrosse team? And I was corrected. No. Our bishop is John Hopkins. The university is Johns, with an S, Hopkins. And then I began to kind of dig a little deeper into what Johns Hopkins is all about. Johns Hopkins just was a grocer in the Baltimore, Maryland area. He'd grown up in a Quaker family, a church family, and one day his father was under conviction They had a farm, and they had several slaves. And he was under conviction. This is back in the early 1800s. And as a result of kind of coming under conviction, Johns Hopkins' father released all of his slaves, a big financial commitment. And as a result, Johns was really had to return back home. He was in school at that time. He had to forego his education in order to come back home and resume in the family business and in the estate at the home. He always regretted that he was never, Johns Hopkins, his big research institute, was never able to finish his higher education. But he became extraordinarily prosperous in his business as a grocer. He then invested into a railroad, the Baltimore and the Ohio Railroad, and did extremely well with that. One day, he was talking to a friend of his, a young man he had known really from their Quaker meeting days. His name was George Peabody. And George Peabody said to Johns Hopkins, "You know, Johns, that the mark of a man is never how much you make. The mark of a man is how much you're willing to give." And he kind of stirred within the soul of Johns Hopkins this element of philanthropy. And so Johns Hopkins, because he never had the chance to finish his education because of his financial situation, he set up a free university in Baltimore, Maryland, which we know today as Johns Hopkins University. And beyond that, Johns Hopkins, he had this sense of compassion for the indigent, for the poor, including the African Americans within the Baltimore, Maryland area. And so he set up a free hospital called Johns Hopkins Hospital. And even today, what kind of legacy that he's led, how many children and young people have been educated there, how many people's lives have been continued and blessed by that particular hospital, all because Johns Hopkins had learned the lessons of the Proverbs, advice from a friend. And I don't mean George Peabody, I mean the advice of a friend we call Proverbs. Again, to remember your priorities, to make sure you don't live beyond your means, to sit there and give generously to the poor, and also to return back to God what belongs to God. It's financial wisdom. You know, as I was looking at the story of Johns Hopkins, I came to his obituary. It was written in the year 1873. It was published by the Baltimore Sun. Johns Hopkins' obituary said this, and I just love this. He said, Johns Hopkins was a rare example of practical beneficence in devoting the gains thus acquired to the public. What an obituary. Wouldn't you like that to be our own legacy? An example of practical beneficence in devoting our gains thus acquired to the public. You know, Proverbs 11 just puts it this way. You know, those who trust in their riches, they're going to wither, but righteous are those who contribute to the public good, are going to flourish like green leaves. Friends, that's all of our challenge. No matter what station we are in life, you know, are we willing to not only make all we can, not only to save all that we can, but then to give all that we can. And if we live out that sound principles, we'll find the blessed life that our friend Proverbs advises us to. Let's pray. Almighty and holy God, we give you thanks for your word that is meant to help us on our daily lives, the things that are most practical to our existence. Lord, open our eyes, open our hearts to receive that which you wish to offer. We ask these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.